the housing numbers are actually adopted, later on in this process. Thank you.
Anyone else? Member Spearing and then Member Bates.
Hey, Ken, can you talk about the affordability? When we talk about affordability, I mean, who is providing that subsidy? When I look at affordability, when you have cities and counties that are charging $70,000 for a permit fee, all these hardscapes, these costs, the very things Sam's talking about, and park fees, the list goes on and on. That doesn't change, and so when you talk about affordability, where and how is that subsidized, and how is that change made?
Well, there, as was mentioned or on the slide, there's an enormous gap, and it varies across the region, across communities, related to a couple of things. One, many of the jurisdictions in the region have an inclusionary law, where a certain percentage of housing needs to be provided for very low, or in some cases moderate income households, but it doesn't meet the task. The private market then providing some support for affordable housing, it doesn't do the full job, even in a strong economy. A lot of communities relied upon redevelopment funds, and the affordable housing component of redevelopment, to build workforce housing. With that going away, that's going to be a significant gap. We have tried to factor in, again, the loss of redevelopment, the loss of affordable housing funds in this early decade, that we're not going to produce as much housing in that period. But that will be, I think, much like the issue of the lenders and the role of financing to produce housing, how that issue gets dealt with is going to be a critical one for the region if we're going to actually produce this housing across the different sectors, particularly for workers. And that's what drove a lot of the development that we had up before the recession, where people heading out to outer parts of the region where they could afford a house. Moderate income households did that in particular. In San Francisco, in the inland East Bay, or the inner East Bay near the Bay, there was very little moderate income housing produced, even though those areas are much closer to jobs. And so people in that income category were going out to where they could find a home.
I'd also, Jim, may I supplement that answer a bit? There's two elements to affordability that we see. One is, as the gentleman pointed out, the issue of subsidized housing. And the way we're doing subsidized housing today is very, very expensive. It costs us about $350,000 on average to produce one subsidized affordable housing unit. If we were buying units and rehabbing them, that same unit, or just about, would cost $30,000 or $35,000. So there are ways to make our system of affordable housing much more efficient, and that has to be taken into account. The second factor is the income gap in the private market, where a lot of the jobs that we're projecting don't have enough incomes to support the cost of these units. Now, the costs of the units are being artificially raised by these fees and other kinds of issues that local governments are providing. So there's going to need to be a change in the government approval process, both with respect to how entitlements are offered, as well as the fee structures that are required, and maybe the source of funds for some of those fees can come from other locations. And I think if the state and federal government do not support the idea of this type of sustainable urbanized housing in some significant way, that income gap between what we're projecting in jobs and the cost of producing the housing is going to be too high to be bridged. So there's a lot of uncertainty and risk as we look at it for our ability as a region to produce that housing. And in our report, we make reference to many different policies that we see are going to be required to actually, over the next 30 years, to meet this challenge. And we plan to elaborate on that quite a bit more in our May report.
It doesn't, through the chair, doesn't this knowledge-based industries approach, doesn't it exacerbate this problem?
Well, the knowledge-based industries provide a multiplier of other jobs that service it. So to the extent that that's a very high value-added sector, that's a great opportunity for the Bay Area. But it doesn't solve the problems of the fact that the many other jobs that support that industry are much lower paying or below median income paying. And that's the income problem. So we've identified the extent of that, and to that We believe there are numbers of changes that have to occur at the state and federal level and at the local level to bridge the gap. And that is the agenda, I think, not of these agencies here, but of the region as a whole and the conversation we need to have with other entities. The federal government and state government supported rental housing in a much greater way in prior decades. They allowed for accelerated depreciation. You could write off ordinary income on losses, and that helped the banks produce rental housing, and that's why we had a lot more construction of that type prior to 1986 when the tax laws changed. In exchange, we got the low-income housing tax credit. But I think that's this type of dialogue that we have to replace redevelopment and replace a mechanism for affordable housing has to focus on the efficiency of the way the system works and the partnership we need to have with state government.
At some point, we're going to have to articulate this challenge with this affordable housing because it's really absent in all the stuff we're looking at. And so I think there needs to be a footnote that says that this really needs to be resolved if we're going to go forward and adopt.
I think we did a pretty good job framing that issue in this report, which we just handed out this morning, so I think we're on our way to do that.
Member Bates.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My questions are sort of